In November 2024, Doug Ford called Trump's tariffs like a family member stabbing you in the heart. By March 2025, he was threatening to cut electricity to 1.5 million American households entirely. By October 2025, he spent $75 million running Ronald Reagan's words against Trump on American television. 1 billion views. Trump froze trade talks, then threatened to add more tariffs on top. Then on July 20th, 2026, Trump signed Section 338 tariffs, 50% on 20 billion of Canadian goods. And Ford walked in front of cameras on July the 21st and said something nobody expected to hear publicly. 4 words that landed on every financial desk and trading floor in North America simultaneously. Subscribe to Money Signals right now. Hit the bell because this story moves faster every single day. Ford said it at the Council of the Federation meeting in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island on Tuesday. He was speaking to reporters before meeting with Indigenous leaders. No teleprompter, no prepared statement. His exact words were captured on camera and published by the Canadian press within minutes of being spoken. We are an energy powerhouse, and we can dismantle the U.S. if we all work together. 4 words: dismantle the U.S. Not negotiate, not retaliate, carefully, not send a diplomatic note to Washington. Dismantle the United States economy, said plainly publicly on record by the Premier of Ontario, Canada. No Canadian politician at any level had publicly said anything close to those 4 words before Tuesday, and the context he wrapped them in is precisely what makes the financial implications genuinely serious. He was not making a bluff. He was listing actual Canadian economic leverage with specific commodities attached. No matter if it's the electricity, the potash, the oil, we're their #1 customer in the world. That last sentence is the one every American who pays an energy bill should understand precisely. Right now, Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, ahead of Mexico. Canada supplies approximately 25% of all U.S. oil imports, more than any other single nation. Ontario alone powers 1.5 million American homes in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota through integrated grid connections. Canada supplies 30% of the softwood lumber that American home builders use for residential construction every year. Canadian potash provides nearly 85% of the potash the American agricultural sector uses for growing food. When Ford said electricity, potash, and oil in one sentence, he was reading from a real leverage list. And that list has actual dollar values attached to it that dwarf the $20 billion Trump just targeted. Trump signed Section 338 tariffs targeting $20 billion in Canadian goods on July 20th, 2026. Ford warned those tariffs would deliver a $28 billion economic impact to Canada if they proceed on August 19th. That $28 billion figure was Ford's public estimate delivered at the same Charlottetown availability Tuesday afternoon, and he tied the dismantle statement directly to that $28 billion threat with the precision of someone who had calculated it. But to understand why July 21st represents a genuine escalation point, the 18-month timeline behind it matters deeply. This relationship did not arrive at dismantle overnight. It traveled here through 18 documented months of escalation. It started with Trump winning the U.S. election in November 2024 and immediately threatening 25% tariffs on Canada. Ford was among the first Canadian leaders to respond publicly, and his response then was the softest it would get. He called it devastating. He called it like a family stabbing you. He still wanted to make a deal. By February 2025, Trump formally invoked AIPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, against Canada, citing fentanyl. That declaration imposed 10% on Canadian energy imports and 25% on everything else entering the U.S. Ford's language changed immediately. He went from wanting a deal to threatening to cut off electricity entirely. At a Toronto mining conference, Ford made a statement that should have gotten more financial attention than it did. He said, "If they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do everything, including cut off their energy." Then he added 5 words that defined the tone of everything that followed in the months after February. He said he would cut off the energy with a smile on his face. Those were his exact words. That language from a conservative premier who had previously praised Trump and pledged his unwavering support was a transformation. Ford had changed from Trump ally to Trump adversary over the span of 3 months of tariff escalation. By March 10th, 2025, that threat became a real action, not a press conference line, but a policy. Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on every megawatt hour of electricity exported to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. Ford said clearly on live television that the surcharge would stay until the tariff threat was gone for good. 1.5 million American homes and businesses woke up facing an estimated $100 increase in their monthly electricity cost. Ford told PBS NewsHour directly, "President Trump's tariffs are a disaster for the U.S. economy, making life more expensive." Trump responded the next morning on Truth Social, threatening to declare a national emergency over electricity and adding more tariffs. U.S. stock markets tumbled that same Tuesday. The S&P 500 recorded its worst session of the year at that point. The Nasdaq fell to its worst single session since 2022, directly connected to trade war escalation that week. One provincial electricity surcharge generated $260,000 in a single day before Ford suspended it 24 hours later. He suspended it after a phone call with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Not because Trump asked nicely. Ford suspended it strategically, extracting a meeting in Washington, D.C. in exchange for pausing the electricity weapon temporarily. That is not backing down. That is a negotiator testing leverage, measuring the reaction, and recalibrating for the next move. And the next move came 7 months later in October 2025. In the form of a $75 million advertisement. Ontario's government commissioned and aired a television ad on American networks featuring the voice of Ronald Reagan himself. Not an impersonator, not a paraphrase, an unedited excerpt from Reagan's 1987 national radio address on foreign trade. Reagan's actual words in his actual voice, telling American audiences that tariffs hurt every American worker and consumer. High tariffs lead to retaliation by foreign countries, Reagan said, triggering fierce trade wars where markets shrink and collapse. Businesses shut down. Millions of people lose their jobs. That was the 40th president's voice on American television in 2025. Ford's government spent around $75 million airing that message on U.S. television stations across multiple markets simultaneously. The campaign generated what Ford later described as 1 billion views across the US, UK, and India combined. Trump called it fraudulent. He accused Canada of trying to interfere in an upcoming US Supreme Court case on tariffs. Then he threatened to add 10% extra tariffs on Canada, above and beyond everything already in place. And Ford stood in front of every camera he could find and said, "We achieved our goal completely." He told reporters the ad was the most successful in the history of North America. And he was not entirely wrong. It had forced the conversation Ford wanted Americans to have about tariffs into living rooms across the United States. Trump's suspension of trade talks triggered by the ad confirmed it had gotten under the administration's skin deeply. And then, on July the 20th, 2026, Trump signed a Section 338 of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act against Canada. 50% tariffs on $20 billion in Canadian goods, wine, dairy, hockey sticks, cement, clothing, machinery, all hit simultaneously. The tariffs override USMCA, the very trade deal Trump himself negotiated and signed during his own first term. The 1930 law used to impose them has not been deployed since 1949, dormant for 77 years. And Ford's response on July 21st, one day later, was not diplomatic, carefully worded language for negotiating purposes. He said Canada is an energy powerhouse. He listed the commodities. He said dismantle. He said they are their #1 customer. That statement was made at the Council of the Federation, Canada's equivalent of a governor's summit in Charlottetown. Every provincial leader in Canada was either in the room or watching the same press availability in real time. Ford was not just speaking to reporters in Prince Edward Island. He was speaking to 12 other premiers simultaneously. He was making the case that Canada's collective leverage, used together, could dismantle the U.S. economy if deployed in full. Ford was not speaking loosely or emotionally when he said dismantle on July 21st, 2026. He was making a calculated argument to 12 other premiers about what unified Canadian leverage actually looks like. And the divisions that immediately emerged from Charlottetown reveal exactly why that word carries so much financial weight. Because not every premier agreed with Ford, and those disagreements define the real boundaries of Canadian leverage precisely. Alberta. Premier Danielle Smith was the most direct voice pushing back on Ford's dismantle framing publicly. She told reporters in Charlottetown that using Alberta's oil as a weapon against the United States will not happen. Not under her watch, not while she is premier of Canada's most oil-dependent provincial economy. Alberta's economy runs on American demand for its crude oil. Cutting that off hurts Alberta first domestically. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe echoed Smith almost immediately. He rejected POTAC and energy export restrictions categorically. Saskatchewan produces approximately 35% of the world's traded POTAC supply. It is not a small number. Withholding Saskatchewan POTAC does not just pressure the United States, it pressures global agricultural markets simultaneously. That global dimension is precisely why Moe and Smith are not willing to pull that particular trigger. New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt took a noticeably different position from her Western Canadian counterparts on Tuesday afternoon. She said leveraging energy exports is something premiers had already been discussing before Charlottetown was even convened this week. Her framing was specific and geographic. New Brunswick sells energy products directly into New England's heating and transportation systems. She pointed out that New Brunswick puts gas in American cars, jet fuel in U.S. military aircraft, and heat in American homes. That last detail, jet fuel in U.S. fighter jets, is the kind of leverage sentence that gets read in Washington. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew offered the political framing that captured what the Charlottetown gathering meant strategically for Canada. He said Trump's decision to impose 50% tariffs on KSMA-compliant goods had united Canada's leaders with a common opponent. A common opponent. That is not diplomatic language. That is a statement of political coalition building in real time. And the coalition at Charlottetown was not just rhetorical. It had a specific economic agenda attached to it. Every premier at the table called on Prime Minister Carney to ramp up intensity and trade talks immediately. British Columbia Premier David Eye was among the most direct voices on what a deal should not look like. He told reporters that no trade deal with the United States is better than a bad deal hurriedly signed. That position, no deal beats a bad deal, represents a fundamental shift from where Canada was 18 months earlier. In late 2024, every Canadian premier was looking for any path back to stable, tariff-free access urgently. By July 2026, multiple premiers were publicly stating they would rather hold the line than accept unfavorable terms quickly. That shift in Canadian negotiating posture has direct implications for the timeline of any resolution before August 19th arrives. And Carney himself emerged from the Tuesday Team Canada meeting with language that was unusually direct for a prime minister. He confirmed he had spoken with Trump by phone after the Section 338 proclamations were signed on July 20th. Both sides agreed to ramp up discussions, but Carney stopped short of calling it a breakthrough of any kind. USR Jameson Greer contradicted Canada's characterization of that phone call almost immediately after Carney's statement was released publicly. Greer told reporters that Carney's version of the call was not telling the truth about what was discussed between them. Two countries, two senior officials, two completely different accounts of the same phone call. That is not a good sign. Now, step back from the politics for a moment and look at what these numbers actually mean for markets. The U.S.-Canada trading relationship handles approximately $3.6 billion in goods crossing the border every single working day. That is not an annual figure split evenly across 12 months. That is the daily throughput of this relationship. On any given Monday through Friday, $3.6 billion worth of physical goods moves across the longest undefended border on Earth. Section 338 targets $20 billion annually across three sectors. Automobiles, dairy, and alcohol is defined in the proclamations. But the supply chain disruption created by a 50% tariff does not stay contained inside three sectors only. Auto parts cross the U.S.-Canada border an estimated 8 times during the manufacturing process for a single vehicle. A 50% tariff applied to a finished Canadian vehicle creates a cost shock at the retail level immediately. But the tariff on components and subassemblies crossing the border multiple times during production compounds that shock significantly further. The Detroit-Windsor corridor is the single busiest commercial border crossing in North America by total trade value annually. Over $100 billion in automotive goods crosses that single crossing point between Ontario and Michigan every single year. Ford's own constituency, Ontario, contains the heart of Canada's automotive manufacturing sector, centered around Windsor and Oshawa. When Ford said he wanted to feel the pain, rather than Canada constantly feeling the pain, he was talking about that corridor. He was talking about Ontario workers, Ontario factories, Ontario supply chains that are directly woven into American automotive production. General Motors, Ford Motor Company, Stellantis all operate integrated manufacturing across that US-Canada border at massive scale, continuously. A Canadian auto tariff does not just affect Canadian workers. It shuts down American assembly lines waiting on Canadian parts. The Center for Automotive Research estimated a full auto trade disruption between Canada and the US could cost 150,000 American jobs. That is not a Canadian estimate designed to apply political pressure. That is an American research institution's own modeling, and the agriculture dimension of this story deserves the same level of attention that the auto sector receives regularly. Canada's supply management system for dairy has been a point of contention in every trade negotiation since NAFTA itself. The US dairy industry has long argued that Canada's import quotas and tariff rate system discriminates against American milk producers. That argument is the specific factual predicate the White House used to justify the Section 338 dairy proclamation legally. But here is the agricultural counter-leverage that Ford was pointing to when he mentioned potash in Charlotte to Town Tuesday. Canadian potash supplies approximately 85% of the potash used in American agriculture for fertilizing crops annually. Without Canadian potash, American agricultural yields decline. Without American agricultural yields, food prices rise for American consumers directly. That is the leverage chain Ford was describing when he said electricity, potash, oil, their number one customer in the world. Each commodity in that list connects directly to something ordinary Americans buy, consume, or depend on every single month. Electricity from Ontario, potash feeding American crops, oil from Alberta filling American gas tanks, lumber building American homes. These are not abstract trade policy figures. They are the physical inputs of American daily life at consumer level. And the financial markets understood the gravity of this moment faster than most political coverage acknowledged it publicly. So on July 21st, the day Ford made his dismantle statement, Canadian and American markets moved in response to the tariff news. The TSX, Canada's main stock index, fell on the tariff announcement before partially recovering on talks optimism later Tuesday. American markets showed volatility concentrated in sectors with direct Canadian supply chain exposure, auto, agriculture, and materials particularly. The pattern was familiar. Every escalation in this trade war since February 2025 has produced the same market signature. Announcement drops markets. Retaliation threat drops them further. Phone call and talks announcement partially recovers the loss temporarily. Then the next escalation arrives and the cycle repeats at a slightly higher level of structural damage each time. Ford named that cycle explicitly in Charlottetown. He said he was tired of the bully taking Canada's lunch money. He said you don't negotiate through weakness, especially with President Trump. And that line was directed at his fellow premiers. It was a message to Smith and Moe as much as it was a message to Washington or to markets. Ford was arguing that Canada's collective leverage, if deployed together, changes the negotiating dynamic in ways individual responses cannot. Ford's argument at Charlottetown was not political theater dressed up in economic language for cameras. It was a read of real leverage, commodity by commodity, that the numbers actually support when examined. And the Scotiabank economics team published research in March 2026 that puts the mathematical floor under Ford's argument precisely. Their analysis used Scotiabank's integrated US-Canada macro model, examining what full CUSMA termination would actually look like numerically. Their conclusion was unambiguous and direct. A failure to ratify CUSMA would negatively impact the US economy significantly. It would simultaneously push Canada into a technical recession, damaging both economies in ways neither side can absorb easily. That Scotiabank research was published before July Section 338 proclamations added another layer of tariff pressure on top. The Bank of Canada's own projections place Canadian GDP finishing 2026 approximately 1.5% below its pre-tariff trajectory. Dioti's summer outlook found Canada technically avoided full recession in 2026, but described growth as anemic and stagnant throughout. The projected growth rate for Canada's full year 2026 economy was 0.7%, barely above zero in real terms. Canada's youth unemployment hit 13.4% in May 2026, a figure that carries real political weight domestically. Inflation climbed to 3.2% in the same month, driven partly by the energy price dynamics Ford described, and Canadian goods exports to the United States fell 5.8% in 2025 under the weight of tariff pressure. The U.S. share of Canadian exports dropped to 71.7%, the lowest level recorded since the early 1980s. Those numbers tell a story that Ford's dismantle language was actually responding to, not creating from thin air. Canada has already absorbed significant economic damage from 18 months of U.S. tariff escalation. The data confirms it fully, and yet Ford's position is that absorbing more damage passively is the wrong negotiating strategy against this particular administration. His exact framing in Charlottetown was pointed and personal. He said he was tired of the bully taking their lunch money. He said Canada does not negotiate through weakness, especially not with President Trump specifically calling him out by name. Uniform National President Lana Payne, whose union represents 315,000 Canadian workers, including auto sector workers, made the same point differently. She told CBC in late June that the cake is baking in the United States right now economically. She pointed to rising energy prices, falling consumer confidence, and the U.S. ambassador to Canada's own recent acknowledgments publicly. Even the U.S. ambassador admitted in recent weeks that America needs things from Canada, critical minerals, potax, and energy specifically. That admission from a sitting U.S. ambassador is not a small concession. It is a validation of Ford's leverage argument. RBC Economics published its own COSMA review analysis, confirming that over 90% of U.S. imports from Canada in 2024 had North American content, 73% Canadian origin, and 19% U.S. origin, meaning the supply chains are genuinely inseparable. You cannot cleanly separate Canadian content from American manufacturing at this stage of economic integration. The systems are fused together. That is the economic reality underneath Ford's political language about dismantling. The leverage is structural, not rhetorical, and it is real. Now, here is the specific financial consequence that American households are closest to feeling before August 19th even arrives. Section 338 tariffs do not apply to energy, POTUC, or fish. The White House explicitly carved those out. That carve-out is its own confession. The administration knows which Canadian exports it cannot afford to target with 50% tariffs. Energy was excluded because Ontario's electricity already demonstrated its power when Ford imposed the 25% surcharge in March 2025. Potash was excluded because American agricultural productivity depends on Canadian POTUC supply in ways that cannot be quickly substituted. Fish was excluded because of specific fishing community dependencies in U.S. border states that have direct political implications for Congress. The carve-outs tell you exactly where American economic vulnerability to Canadian leverage actually lives, and Ford named all three publicly. By publicly listing electricity, potash, and oil in the same sentence with dismantle, Ford was reading the carve-out list back to Washington. He was saying, we both know why those were excluded, and we both know what happens if that changes. That is not bluster. That is one side of a negotiation telling the other side what cards they are holding. And the customer review, which formally commenced July 1st, 2026, is the table where those cards will ultimately be played. The review process does not have a fixed deadline for completion. It can stretch into annual reviews through to 2036 potentially. U.S. Ambassador Pete Hockra told Canadian media in September 2025 that the review could stretch into 2027 given the complexity. A page-by-page renegotiation of the most complex trilateral trade agreement in North American history takes considerable time and political will. Every day that process extends without resolution is another day of uncertainty for businesses making investment and hiring decisions across both countries. The Center for Automotive Research's estimate of 150,000 American jobs at risk from full auto trade disruption sits in that uncertainty. American homebuilders waiting on Canadian lumber decisions sit in that uncertainty. American farmers dependent on Canadian potash sit there too. And 1.5 million American households in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota know exactly what Canadian electricity leverage feels like personally already. They felt it for exactly one day in March 2025. $100 extra on their monthly bill for 24 hours. Ford suspended the surcharge after one day, but the memory of those 24 hours did not leave Washington quickly. It produced a phone call with the Commerce Secretary, a meeting in Washington, D.C., and a temporary de-escalation immediately. That is the pattern Ford is drawing on when he makes his dismantle argument to fellow premiers in Charlottetown. He proved in March 2025 that even one day of electricity leverage produced a meeting at the cabinet level. He is arguing that coordinated, sustained leverage across multiple provinces and commodities would produce something significantly more substantial than one meeting. British Columbia's EBE says no deal beats a bad deal. New Brunswick's HALT has her energy exports ready as leverage. Manitoba's Kenyu says Canada is very united. Ford says everything is on the table, and Canada cannot keep rolling over. The only clear dissenters are Smith in Alberta and Moe in Saskatchewan, and their reasons are economically transparent. Alberta's oil revenue depends on American refineries processing it. Saskatchewan's potash revenue depends on American farms buying it. Full stop. Cutting off those exports hurts Alberta and Saskatchewan before it meaningfully pressures Washington. The geographic economics make that unavoidable. That division inside Canada's own coalition is the specific crack that Washington's trade negotiators will attempt to exploit going forward. Get Alberta and Saskatchewan to break from the Team Canada posture. And Ford's dismantle argument loses its commodity backbone entirely, which is precisely why Ford was not just talking to cameras in Charlottetown. He was talking directly to Smith and Moe. He needs their commodities in the leverage conversation, even if they never agree to actually cut those exports off. The threat of unified Canadian commodity leverage is itself a negotiating asset, even if it never gets deployed in practice, and August 19th is 30 days away. The clock is running on $20 billion in Section 338 tariffs simultaneously. 4 words from a provincial premier on July 21st to find the posture Canada is carrying into those 30 days ahead. Dismantle the U.S., said plainly on camera at Charlottetown with 12 other premiers listening in the same room. Whether it is a bluff or a blueprint depends entirely on what happens between now and August 19th at the negotiating table. What is not a bluff is the economic data underneath those 4 words, and that data is completely verifiable. If you want to keep tracking every move in this story as it develops toward that August 19th deadline, subscribe to Money Signals right now and hit the bell so every update reaches you the moment it publishes. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada will actually use its energy leverage before August 19th arrives? This audience calls these developments faster than most financial media covers them.